All right, so we'll get started. As Elisa said, it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, so we're going to be talking about healthy eating to reduce your risk of breast cancer. So very briefly, I'll go through what we're going to go through in this PowerPoint today. We're first going to start off talking about healthy eating guidelines as established by the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Then we're going to go into diet and risk for breast cancer, followed by food prep and how we can maximize our nutrient intake, followed by fluid consumption, and briefly touching on supplements and weight loss for risk of breast cancer. And finally, we're going to talk about what diet you can follow, how to build some healthy plates, and some substitutions that can help you when you're looking for healthier options. And then before we open time for questions, I can also share some nutrition counseling resources if you're looking to work with an outpatient dietitian at this time. All righty. So starting with healthy eating guidelines. So what are the dietary guidelines for Americans? The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are a set of recommendations updated and distributed every 5 years that are going to summarize the current body of knowledge that we have on nutrition sciences. So the USDA and the HHS branches of the US government are going to come together and they're going to bring forth all of these recommendations that offer science-backed food recommendations that promote health and prevent diet-related diseases across the lifespan. So there are 5 main goals of the Dietary Guidelines, and they're going to be following a healthy dietary pattern at every lifestyle, while also ensuring that these nutrient-dense foods are going to be customized to personal preferences and reflect cultural traditions. We're also looking to consume nutrient-dense foods and beverages to meet calorie and food needs while limiting foods that are high in added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, as well as reducing or completely avoiding the consumption of alcoholic beverages. There are also highlights on these guidelines that I think are important starting points of a healthy diet. So we're going to look at added sugars, which the Dietary Guidelines ask for no more than 10% of total calories from added sugar per day. So if we're thinking about a 2,000 calorie diet, that's about 50 grams of added sugar. However, when we look closer into this data, the American Heart Association urges for even less, with 25 grams a day for women and 36 grams of added sugar per day for men. Moving on to sodium, we're looking for less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, and the same as added sugar, we're looking for less than 10% total of daily calories from saturated fat. So looking at a 2,000 calorie diet, we want 22 grams of that to be saturated fat or less. Moving on into diet and risk for breast cancer, we're going to talk about how our nutrition choices can impact our risk for breast cancer. So starting with what we do know. So healthy eating is attributed to lower all-cause mortality due to its effectiveness in reducing cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. So LDL-C is also known as our bad cholesterol because it's the lipid that carries cholesterol throughout our body. Healthy eating is also related to lower incidence of obesity and type 2 diabetes, higher BMI, waist circumference, and body fat. So all of these factors and all these positive outcomes of healthy eating are related to a lower risk of cancer. However, are we truly reaping these benefits? If we look at this chart to our right here, if I can get it, okay, there we go. So this comes from the Dietary Guidelines of Americans, and this is going to compare our dietary intakes compared to recommendations. So we're truly not benefiting from the power of a healthy diet because most Americans are really not following a healthy dietary pattern at all. So specifically looking at this chart to the right, we can see that Americans are performing significantly under the average for most of the food groups. So if we're looking more closely at total vegetables with that red arrow, we can see that Americans are eating around 90% less vegetables than the average recommendation. As well as fruits, we're eating about 80% under recommendations, and even more so in grains. You can see with whole grains, we're almost 100% below the level of recommendation. But then when you look towards the right of whole grains, we see refined grains. You're thinking of like things like white bread. We are eating almost 100% over our recommendations. So from this chart, we can kind of see where we're falling short on a diet and where we can make some really big changes that will make big differences. Looking more closely into fruits and vegetables, the dietary guidelines aim for 2.5 cups of vegetables and 2 cups of fruit per day. When it comes to canned, fresh, or frozen, there are a lot of opinions regarding which is the best, and most people assume that fresh produce is of higher quality than canned or frozen. Now, if fresh produce is available and affordable to you and in season, fresh produce is a great option. However, sometimes people, go for the cheaper option, and a lot of times canned and frozen fruits and vegetables are going to be a little more budget friendly. And especially in drier or colder seasons when fresh produce that's in season is not really available, you can totally go for canned or frozen produce and it will be the exact same. What a lot of people don't know is that most of our canned and frozen fruits are picked and packaged at peak ripeness, so they're as fresh upon consumption as they were during harvest. So I don't want you to think that fresh produce is superior to the canned and frozen. They all have a place in our diet and can be super beneficial, even in times of convenience. So a little more tips about getting in your fruits and vegetables. I always say, eat the rainbow. When consuming any produce, regardless of its origin, it's always important to include all the colors. Different fruits and vegetables of different color are going to contain a lot of variety of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants that are vital to our health. So looking at vegetables, it's really important to consume those dark leafy greens like kale and spinach, but it's also important not to forget the bright oranges, reds, and yellows like peppers and carrots. It's also important to read labels. This is going to be a topic I cover a lot on this presentation. Reading labels is so important so that you can ensure the food you're eating doesn't have added sugars or sodium. And there are also ways that if you do buy something that's canned and higher in sodium, you can get rid of the sodium from the brine by simply putting it in a colander, rinsing it off, and it'll take off all that residue from the brine that it's been sitting in the can with. Moving on to salt and sugar intake. So looking at sodium, we really want to focus on foods that are lower in sodium and also really be able to recognize foods that are going to be inherently high in sodium. So anytime foods are preserved or they're able to be frozen to fresh, a lot of times they're going to be higher in sodium. Especially in restaurants as well, it's very common for meals to be higher in sodium to emphasize that flavor. So it's really important when eating out, we're not picking up the salt shaker to add additional salt as it's probably already has additional salt on it already. As well as when we're in the grocery store, we can look at labels and we can see if a canned soup is going to have more of a reduced sodium or if it's going to be super high. Something that's helpful with sodium and added sugar labels is looking at the daily value, which is going to tell you how much of that product has sodium out of the total calories. This is helpful for both sodium and added sugar, but especially I always think of like soups. You can always find a lower sodium soup option that's going to have probably half the amount of sodium than the standard. Now, looking at added sugars, I want to emphasize that there's a difference between added versus natural sugar. So added sugars are any sugar that are found in any food product that was put during processing. So if you're thinking like any of these processed goods, like cakes, muffins, or anything, that's going to be added sugar. But natural sugars are anything that's innate to the actual food. So for example, the sugars in a banana are going to be a natural sugar, while the sugars in a cupcake are going to be added. And although it's true that both sugars are going to impact blood glucose no matter what, the difference is that added sugars are refined and they're going to go into the bloodstream a lot faster. And that's what's going to create those inconsistent blood glucose levels over time. So giving you some more examples on food labels, you can see here the sodium content of 2 food labels for the exact same sauces. So one of them is a traditional spaghetti sauce and the other one's just a marinara sauce, both tomato sauces, but you can see just from the daily value that the traditional one contains 23% of the daily value, which is considered high, while the other sauce only has 2%. And looking at the sugar content, you can also get a key on the added sugars from the nutrition label. So in this label, you can see that under the carbohydrates, you'll have a section for sugars. And now recommendations also make you include the added sugar. So you really want to focus on that added sugar and make sure that it's not super high. So again, I cannot reiterate how helpful it can be to read labels and know what to look for. All right, and briefly touching on red meat. So red meat is a great thing to include in your diet about 1 to 2 times per week. It's going to have that really good source of iron that our body needs. But also it's important to remember to keep it limited. When we're consuming a lot of red meat, it's going to contain those higher contents of iron. And within iron is heme. And that's the component that binds to oxygen. But excessive amounts of this heme have been shown to be related to stress and inflammation. And this stress and inflammation can be attributed to cancer. Moreover, consumption of fattier red meats are going to have higher saturated fat. So when we're thinking about kind of meats that we want to consume, we want to keep it to 1 to 2 times a week, but we also want to make sure that it's going to be those leaner cuts. So if you're unsure and you're in the grocery store looking at different cuts and unsure of which ones are going to be leaner, not only can you analyze how much fat is on the outside of the meat, but you can also look at the name. So a lot of times loin, round, and flank are going to be your leanest cuts, and this can also apply to like pork cuts as well. All right, moving on to food prep. So we can look at the different styles of food prep and see if some of them could be harmful to your health while others can be more beneficial. So first, thinking about what you should avoid doing at all or even regularly. So first, we're going to look at salt curing. So thinking of dried meats and sausages, a lot of times these contain nitrates, nitrites, and nitrosamines. So these are all compounds that are used to preserve the meat. But these preservatives usually react with the proteins within the meat, and they can become carcinogenic, especially when heated. So even if you take something that's not dried, say you're just cooking a steak and you're cooking it to a very high temperature on the grill and creating those dark black burn marks, those can create compounds that are carcinogenic. So when we're thinking about meat, we really want to think about broiling, baking, and slowly roasting that meat to avoid it becoming to super high temperatures to the point where it burns. Looking more so at vegetables, we can think of blanching, steaming, and baking versus cooking on a grill and getting it super hot and charred, so that this way we can avoid those carcinogenics from forming, as well as cooking on a lower and shorter temperature, we can preserve the nutrients while cooking. On to fluid intake. So first we're going to briefly touch on alcohol, and then we're going to talk about water. So alcohol is a group 1 human carcinogen, meaning that this food group is cancer causing to humans. And in this case, alcohol is attributed to 7 types of cancer, with one of them being breast cancer. So what do we consider a drink? So the dietary guidelines state that a drink is either 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of liquor. And the guidelines state that men should be drinking 2 drinks or less per day and women 1 drink or less. So looking more so at women and risk for breast cancer, women that have 1 drink a day have 7 to 10% increased risk in breast cancer than non-drinkers, while women with 2 to 3 drinks a day have a 20% increased risk, and women who even drink infrequently, just a few times a week here and there, have a 5% increased risk compared to non-drinkers. So the 3 ways that alcohol can be a risk factor for cancer are obesity, carcinogenic byproducts, and decreased absorption of nutrients. So with alcohol, it's going to have excess calories that have no nutritional profile. So when we're consuming alcohol in excess amounts, we're increasing our calorie intake, but not getting any benefits from nutrients. And a lot of times we're replacing our intake with alcohol. So that increases our risk of obesity. And as stated before, obesity-related inflammation can cause cancer. Moving on, when alcohol is broken down, its byproducts create oxidative stress in the body, which creates inflammation and damages DNA and prevents the body from repairing it. With cancer, it's uncontrolled cell growth and tumor formation, and with alcohol consumption, this is directly impacting that. Lastly, alcohol decreases the body's ability to absorb certain nutrients. One that I wanted to mention is with chronic alcohol consumption, you're very commonly deficient in folate, and those deficiencies are linked to breast cancer. Moving on to water, I wanted to touch on the different kinds of water. So I'm going to be talking about spring and alkaline water. So spring water comes from natural sources, and alkaline water comes from natural sources or can be manufactured, but both contain minerals and have a higher pH than tap water. So a lot of times people believe that these waters are superior to tap water, and I'll tell you why. So some research suggests that cancer cells grow best in an acidic environment, which is why some people believe these waters are superior, because they believe that consumption of a higher pH water will create this acidic environment that's inhospitable for cancer growth. However, I'm here to debunk this information and tell you that a lot of this information is not backed by science, because pH of the body is very highly regulated. The pH of a water that we're drinking, unless we're drinking it in copious, impossible amounts, cannot change the pH of our blood. As well as a lot of these studies are done on animal subjects and are not transferable to humans and the way that tumors behave in the human body. So instead, I'm going to talk about tap water. And I wanted to state that the moral of the story is that drinking tap water is better than drinking no water at all. Most of the time, alkaline and spring waters can be hard to find, or they're more expensive. And at the end of the day, as long as we're hydrated, that is the most important thing. So the DRI goal is 1 milliliter per kcal. So if you're eating about 2,000 calories a day, you want to go for 2 liters of water a day. So that's about 8.5 cups. All right, I'll briefly touch on some supplementation. So the dietary guidelines really promote meeting your needs through a diet, because you're going to get those whole sources and complete proteins. However, if that's not feasible to you and you find joy in drinking some oral supplements throughout the day, or you supplement with multivitamins, these can also help you meet your needs. But we also have to remember that certain supplements are not appropriate for certain individuals, and depending on any pre-existing health conditions or medications, they may not be best suitable for you. So I really wanted to highlight that it's super important to consult with a physician before implementing anything new in your diet if you're unsure of its benefits to you. Moving on to weight loss and how this can reduce your risk for breast cancer, I will talk about some weight loss supplements that have been on the market. A lot of these are new and there's a lot of contrary information about them, so I wanted to give a little bit of information on all of them so you could understand what they do and what they can be benefiting for. So orlistat is the only FDA-approved over-the-counter pill for weight loss, but it's only prescribed to individuals with overweight or obesity and that are following a low-calorie diet and exercise program. The other ones that you've seen more so in the media are going to be Ozempic and Wegovy. So Ozempic is originally targeted for individuals with type 2 diabetes, and it's quickly grown popular in the media for its profound and rapid weight loss effects. So the way Ozempic works is it mimics a hormone in our body that stimulates insulin. And when insulin is stimulated, it increases that satiety and fullness in our brain, slows digestion, and reduces our blood glucose. A lot of times, Ozempic is covered by insurance when it is given to those with diabetes. On the other hand, Wegovy is very similar to Ozempic as they contain the same drug, but it's different in the sense that Wegovy contains different constitutes of the drug, and it's slightly different because it's targeted for weight loss rather than blood glucose control. So FDA recently approved Wegovy in 2021 for weight loss, but a lot of times it's not covered by insurance, so that can kind of make people want to go more for the Ozempic. But again, I just wanted to give a little bit of information on all of the supplements that are out there on the market. And as we talk about weight loss, I really wanted to talk about the importance of physical activity. I feel like a lot of times when we think of physical activity, it seems like this big thing that's going to take up a lot of time. But I really wanted to just emphasize that a majority of our health is contingent on diet, but that does not mean that physical activity should be disregarded. So as long as you can find a form of movement that feels good for you, is something that you enjoy and it feels meaningful, and it keeps your mind and muscles strong is the main goal. It doesn't have to be costly or time consuming and can be something as simple as a 20-minute walk, a stationary bike ride, or even using some light weights a few times a week. This is because physical activity indirectly reduces risk by reducing chronic inflammation related to excess body fat. So moving on to the big picture, what diet can we start to establish that can really help us emphasize our health and reduce our risk of breast cancer? So majority of Americans are following what we know as a Western diet. It's typically high in saturated fats, refined grains and added sugars, and lower in fruits and vegetables. On the contrary, we know the Mediterranean diet. And this is a great diet model that I love to share because it's great for kind of conceptualizing how we can live a healthier lifestyle through our diet. So the Mediterranean diet is consistent of lean proteins and low-fat dairy, healthy fats, whole grain versus refined grains, emphasis on fish and shellfish for those omega-3s, which are great for reducing inflammation, and fruits, vegetables, and legumes. So if you're starting from scratch and you don't know where to start, the Mediterranean diet can be a really great blueprint to understanding what you're looking for in each food group. So when we're thinking of proteins, instead of just thinking of proteins as a whole, you can think of, okay, when I go to the store, I need to look for those leaner proteins. And when I'm buying things like dairy, cottage cheese, I want to pick those lower fat options. So it can be a really great blueprint to start your healthy eating. Another thing that can be helpful is learning how to build a plate. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before, the My Plate, but I think it's a great visual example of what a plate should look like. So you really want to start by filling half the plate with fruits and vegetables. So to kind of conceptualize it, you want to have about half a cup to 3/4 of a cup of each fruit and vegetable in your meal. And then a quarter of your plate should be a lean protein. You want to aim for about 4 ounces or a fistful of lean protein at each meal. And then finally, your remaining quarter of your plate should contain a carbohydrate. And you really want to try to aim for those whole grains versus the refined. And then lastly, you always want to include some low-fat dairy to get your calcium and other vitamins and minerals. And lastly, I wanted to touch on some food substitutions. So when starting a new diet, it can feel really overwhelming. You don't know where to start. If you see something that looks maybe like there could be a better alternative, it's sometimes hard to decide what to go for. So when thinking about added sugars, We can switch out the frosted cereals to ones that contain whole grains, as well as switching out yogurts with added sugars and flavors for plain yogurt, and then you top it with your own fruit and granola. When looking at protein groups, again, we're opting for those leaner options, and we can even try to include some plant-based options such as legumes when we can. Reiterating the importance of food labels, we really want to find those options that are lower in sodium, added sugars, and we also want to avoid labels that are very long ingredient lists because a lot of times they're going to contain additives, preservatives, and things that we don't necessarily need in our food to be beneficial. For fat choices, we're going to choose our options lower in saturated fat and then replace them with options high in unsaturated fats, such as salmons, nuts and seeds, eggs, and oils. Lastly, if we're thinking about beverages, if we have soda, once in a while, it's okay to enjoy those things. And then we also can look for some sugar-free alternatives or even just opt for a sparkling water or seltzer. Again, I really want to emphasize that it's important to remember that food is meant to be enjoyed. It can hold memories. It's culturally significant. But we also want to remain vigilant to be mindful of those choices. You know, enjoying foods here and there is great and it can build memories, but we also want to remember that these choices that we make every day as small choices can lead to big changes across our lifespan. So I just wanted to end on that note, but also share some nutrition counseling. So currently I'm a dietetic intern, so I just work with other dietitians, but if you are looking to work with an outpatient counseling dietitian, we do have one here at NYP Westchester. Her name is Katie Campbell, and she works out of Eastchester. So I have this on the slide. I will give this slide for distribution if you want to look back on it. You want to call Katie and see if you would like to work with her. So don't feel rushed to write this down at the moment. I will send out this slide, but I just wanted you to know that it is available to you.
Lily, I think there's a question in the chat.
Sure. Okay. Yes, I'm all set. So we can definitely open up for questions. Let me see if I can read it. All right, so question. The My Plate quantities. Is the quantity different if most of vegetables eaten are cooked? Uncooked veggies like salad take up a lot of space. Yes. So there are things that will change based on if you cook them or not. A lot of times, I think that you don't have to necessarily be so worried about the volume of vegetables because a lot of times, like the non-starchy vegetables like zucchini, cucumbers, peppers, onions, all of those things are lower in calories. So they're a great volume food. So it's really great to fill up your plate with those things because you're not going to have to worry about them overloading your calories. Now, there are other foods like say like a banana or like other kinds of fruits that will be higher in calories. So like mango. So you want to be careful of overloading on foods that are going to be more calorically dense. I think with My Plate, it's also good to think about the protein options. A lot of times when we cook meat, it shrinks. So the weight of what we're cooking raw is going to be very different than what the weight ends up being when it's cooked. The same thing goes with carbohydrates. So when we cook rice, it's going to double in size. Pasta doubles in size. So if you think about you're going to cook this much pasta, when it gets filled with water, when it's boiling, it's probably going to be this much. So what you think may be one portion, maybe two or three. So a lot of times when you're looking at those labels, they'll give you the dry weight. So honestly, that's a good example. So like even when you're cooking like spinach, you can have like this massive amount in your hand. And when you cook it, it cooks it down to almost nothing. So if you're interested in weighing things out, I would keep it consistent or measuring. So if you're always measuring things as the raw weight, I would keep it as that versus teeter-tottering between the cooked and the dry weight. But again, with vegetables, you know, the more the better. They're chock full of nutrients and everything. So if you're worried about overeating, I think, you know, the more the better. So I would just be more aware of definitely like the carbohydrate consumption and the protein. Can we overdo vegetables? I've never heard of anybody overdoing vegetables. I don't think it necessarily needs to be something of concern. I think, you know, as long as you're making an intentional act to have, I'm going to have one serving at breakfast today, and then I'm going to have a smaller serving at lunch today. I think as long as you're making that mindful connection to at least have some during each meal, you're going to hit your mark. But I don't think necessarily there's going to be an instance of eating too much of them. Obviously, the same way that any calories are going to fill you up, you're going to get full if you eat so much of like a vegetable. But I think if you just strategically place your plate with half of the fruits and vegetables, a little protein, a little carbs, and you start with working through the protein and the vegetables first, then by the time you eat the carbs, you're going to have a completely satisfied meal and you're not going to be like going back for more and more. Yeah, so sometimes it could be like proportional to the plate. Sometimes you just like if it says half, the plates are different sizes. So I think definitely if you have access to like measurements and like measuring cups and stuff like that, it could be super helpful in ensuring that you're eating enough. How can we make lower sodium and lower fat foods taste better? Yes. Okay. So honestly, I hear you say I've tried a lower calorie mayonnaise and the taste was so different. Yeah. So definitely with making lower sodium options taste better. I think a lot of times when people think of flavor, they automatically go to salt. And it's true that we need a little bit of salt to taste these flavors in our foods. But honestly, we can't forget about all of the spices. And I think that's so important when thinking about different cultures and the food. So many cultures have these different spices that they add to their food that add so much flavor without adding this excessive sodium. So I think it could be really good idea to get in the kitchen and play around with different flavors, try new recipes, try new spices. I think they could really amplify a dish without adding excess sodium. As for lower fat foods, I think for things like if you're buying like lower fat yogurts and cottage cheese, sometimes they can taste just like a little bland. So you can always add something to them. I'm always adding like fruit to my cottage cheese, or I'm adding a little drizzle of honey, or I'm adding some granola and like apples to my yogurt. So it's things that I think you can add, but also with things like lower calorie mayonnaise, you can also just adjust your portions of regular calorie things. And also, even just making things at home can help with the nutritional content. A lot of times in these mayonnaises in the store, they're adding a lot of these stabilizers, adding more oil, adding more egg yolk. If we make it at home, we could really keep those ingredients minimal and hopefully won't disturb the taste so much. But again, if you're trying things and you don't like them, that doesn't mean you have to force yourself to like them and eat them. It's a lot of trial and error. But I think definitely adding spices to things and just playing around with different flavor components can really help you enjoy new meals. What do you suggest to use to measure? Is it better to use a scale or a measuring utensil? Honestly, I think all are fine. It really just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you have access to. If you have measuring cups and you feel like you can get a really good gauge on what you're eating and you're comfortable with the measurements of it, I don't think you need to like go out and spend money on a scale. I know I own a scale, and honestly, it is so much easier once you get the hang of it. Even with things like cooking and baking, like measuring things out on the scale is just a lot quicker and it can be really precise. Again, it's something that you have to learn with trial and error, but I think if you have either, you know, a measurement is a measurement, and as long as you're comfortable with the measurement that it gave you and you're confident that it's right, I don't think you need to like go out and get some new gadget in order to do it correctly. So it really just depends on what you're willing to try and what you're willing to be comfortable doing. But either or is fine. All right, next question. Notice that families that order out, seem to be heavier than those that eat more home prepared meals, even though not fast food. Any reasons for that? Yeah, so I think that, obviously we all like to enjoy eating out here and there. Some days we just get home, we don't want to cook, and that's totally fine. A lot of times I really want to emphasize that this is supposed to be a lifestyle. This is supposed to be something that's sustainable, but also making those mindful choices. So if we have the resources, we have the groceries at home, and we have the constituents to make a meal at home, we should definitely opt to do that. Thinking about even like ingredients in a grocery store, a lot of times the ingredient list is going to be double the length of what it would require to make something at home. So a lot of times with fast food and even restaurant type food, a lot of times there's going to be a lot of added ingredients. And the main goal of restaurant food is to have that flavor. And a lot of times chefs are going to be adding more sodium, more oils, more butter, more fat to make the food really palatable. So when you're thinking of that in the grand scheme of things, if you're constantly eating these foods throughout the week, a lot of times a meal that at home would be, say, around 500 calories is going to be 800 plus at a restaurant. So if you're eating that multiple times throughout the week, it's going to create that excess calorie intake and is going to be relayed into weight gain. So that is a correct observation. Another question. Do you recommend eating raw vegetables, and are there any problems with eating raw overcooked? Okay. So I think that you can get benefits from both, but I also do think that when you cook foods, it can change the flavor. So a lot of times I think of like broccoli and cauliflower, the way you eat those raw and the flavor they have when they're raw is very different than what they taste like cooked. So if you eat raw vegetables and you don't like the taste, don't force yourself to eat it because you think it's better. If you like it the way it tastes steamed, definitely go for it and do it steamed. A lot of times also, if you're dealing with some kind of GI distress, you're having a stomach ache or there's some kind of thing going on with your stomach, a lot of times these raw vegetables are going to take a lot of our GI tract to break down, and that can create some irritability, some inflammation, gas, bloating, all those kinds of things. So if you're experiencing some kind of GI distress, it might be more beneficial to have those softer, more cooked vegetables, as well as keeping in mind that some vegetables are going to take more gas. They're called cruciferous vegetables. So we're thinking like eggplant, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, all of those are going to create gas in the breakdown. So if you're having trouble with gas, maybe putting in vegetables that create more gas probably won't feel the best. But in terms of if one's better than the other, I don't think so. But also just being aware that sometimes when you cook things, some of the nutrients can come out through the cooking process. So if you're boiling vegetables and then you throw out that water that the broccoli was cooking in, it's going to also throw out all that water that's containing those nutrients. You want to just be mindful of the ways you're cooking them too. You mentioned stress and inflammation can be bad for your health. How is inflammation measured? Should we see a doctor to determine how it may be impacting our lives? And what are the best ways to reduce inflammation? Yes. So more so in the clinical setting, I think you would use the term that inflammation's measured because a lot of times when inflammation is present in the body, there's going to be certain values in our labs, like in our blood labs, that are going to be elevated or decreased due to inflammation. But I think more so talking about general healthy eating, I think we would just, be able to feel that inflammation. A lot of times when we're feeling stress, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, I feel so inflamed. I feel so bloated." So a lot of times when you're having these abnormal symptoms of abdominal bloating, extra gas, poor bowel movements, extra stress, just in the mental clarity of things, a lot of times that can be signs that there's some inflammation going on. But I think that a lot of times when we feel stress, we stress even more. So I think the number one thing I can say is if you're feeling stress and feel like there's some inflammation going on in your GI tract, really just taking the time to do things to relieve that stress, even as simple as engaging in some physical activity. A lot of times just going for a simple walk when you're having an upset stomach or you're feeling stressed can dramatically reduce stress. So even if it sounds like, oh, just a 20-minute walk, that's super simple. If we're constantly making strides to do these small habits that lower our stress, think about how it will impact the grand scheme of things. Yes, so the cruciferous vegetables are good for you nutritionally, but can cause discomfort. Yes. So are there positives benefiting overweighing the negatives? So again, if you are noticing that every time you're eating cruciferous vegetables and it's really causing you this distress and this pain, I wouldn't continue eating it if it doesn't feel good for you. There's so many vitamins and minerals that you can get from different fruits and vegetables. And if that one vegetable is just really not working out for you, it's not something that you should continue to put your body under distress to digest. I mean, obviously, there are also over-the-counter things that can help with digestion. Even things like, Gas-X are very good for when you have that abdominal bloating and excess gas. But if you're noticing even with those remedies or even just trying to cook the cruciferous vegetable a different way, if those aren't providing relief, you could always just try to replace that vegetable with something else. I think a lot of times people just automatically take something out of the diet and they don't work to replace it. So if you're taking a vegetable out of your diet that you don't like, make sure to replace it with something that you do like, so you're not losing those vitamins and minerals. Okay, continuing to eat foods that cause issues to the GI, is that bad? So I think that with the research that I've seen, only in like certain cases. So like, for example, somebody that has celiac disease and they just can't digest gluten. It's bad to continue to repetitively eat this gluten because it's going to damage the villi on the small intestine that are responsible for absorbing these nutrients. So if you're constantly eating gluten when you can't absorb it, you're going to ruin those absorptive capacity of the intestine, and then you're going to end up not being able to absorb any nutrients, not just the gluten. And this could go for, people that are lactose intolerant as well. I mean, I don't think I know like the FODMAP diet has become popular. They're still doing a lot of research on its benefits. And, a lot of people that have like irritable bowel disorder have found a lot of relief in following a FODMAP diet. But I think just with a lot of these things that are GI related, they're so new and still a lot of research developing that a lot of it is just trial and error. But again, I can't emphasize enough, if you're eating something and it doesn't feel good for you, just take a break from it. If you're feeling better without it, maybe reevaluate if you want to put it back in your diet. But I don't necessarily think anything should be taken out of your diet without proof of intolerance. A lot of people just automatically, when they're having GI distress, they're like, it's gluten, I'm removing gluten completely, or I'm removing dairy completely, when they don't know if that's the root cause. And a lot of times when we pull these foods out for a long period of time, when we try to reintroduce them, our body thinks it's this foreign object and it actually becomes intolerant to it. So I think you should just be careful with things that you take out long term, but also you know your body best. If it doesn't feel good for you, you can just take it out for the time being and then obviously talk to a doctor about it. What are preferred sugar and sodium alternatives? So for sugar alternatives, a lot of times we try to go for sugar that is natural. So adding sweetness with fruits and other things like that. But if there are times when you want to add sugar to something that you're baking, if you feel like you want to go for something that's like 0 calorie, there are like 0 calorie sugar alternatives on the market. And then also, again, there are times when we are, having a birthday and we want to enjoy our favorite cake and it has sugar in it. And like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you you can't have your favorite birthday cake for your birthday. So obviously, in the grand scheme of things, we want to go for those sugars that are more natural because we want to think about how they're going to be ingested in the bloodstream. And we don't want, when we consume refined sugars, they go into the bloodstream like this and dip down really fast. Our goal with blood sugar is to keep it steady over a period of time. And that's the main role of sugar. So the FODMAP diet is going to be a diet that was instated to help people with GI distress, kind of going back to those foods that cause gas. So it's even not just limited to like those cruciferous vegetables. There are also other foods in that diet that they just, when they sit in the gut, they sit there and ferment. And that's when they cause that gas before they're digested. So a lot of times the FODMAP diet, they'll recommend people to take those FODMAP containing foods out of their diet and slowly reintroduce them one by one to see where they can catch what food is bothering their stomach. But it's a very lengthy process. And a lot of times it's done under the practice or supervision of a doctor or a dietitian. So if you think one of those foods is maybe bothering you, could try to just take out that one. I don't know how much I would recommend doing a full FODMAP diet without extensive research. But again, research is available to everybody if you feel like you would like to investigate that more. So yeah. How do people know which FODMAP food is causing issues? Yeah, so that's when they'll have you take out all the food from your diet, get you to a baseline level, and then slowly every few weeks introduce one food from the FODMAP group until they can see if none of them give you a problem or if one of them does or if multiple do. So that's kind of how they do that. What is normal amount of time food should stay in the digestive system? It is normal. Is it normal to also have food pass through entire GI by next morning? Okay, yeah. So a lot of times we have to think about our stomach is like a reservoir. It's meant to hold food for a long period of large volumes of food for a period of time, and it slowly lets it go into the small intestine where it's going to be absorbed. So the goal is not to eat food and just automatically digest it and be like, all right, like, why is it still in my stomach? Why have I not had a bowel movement yet? So a lot of times I think people think like when you eat something and you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, they think that that's the food that you had just eaten like an hour or two ago. But a lot of times that's food that's been sitting in your stomach maybe from multiple hours prior or even the night before. And it's been working overnight to digest, and your body's really working hard to absorb the nutrients that it needs, as well as excrete the nutrients that it doesn't need through bowel movements. So it is normal for food to stay in the digestive tract. I'm not sure of the exact time, and I don't want to speak on something I'm not 100% positive of, but I know that it's normal for it to sit in the digestive tract for a few hours and even overnight. But if you're coming into times where you're feeling like it's been a very long time since a bowel movement, that can be cause for concern that you can investigate and also help with home remedies. Yeah, so if you think that your digestive is moving fast, I mean, if you're eating a meal and like an hour later you're going to the bathroom, a lot of times it's that reflex in our stomach where our stomach's like, okay, like our body's eating some food, time to make room for it. Like, let's get the digestive tract moving. So if you're having food, having that normal bowel movement, that is normal. If you feel like you're eating food and automatically, having symptoms of diarrhea, if that's what you mean by too fast, that could be a sign of, maybe there's an intolerance, but even something as simple as you may be catching a cold, and, in times of that, our body sometimes has bowel movements such as diarrhea. And even sometimes medications we're on, how much water we're drinking, how much fiber we're eating can all play a role on what our bowel movements look like.
Yeah, I have a question. I was trying to type it in the chat. It's Elisa
No
again.
problem.
Since we're on the topic, which people don't like to talk much about in terms of digestion and bowel movements, I actually have a friend who swears by coffee enemas. I don't know if you've heard about those, but I'm just wondering what your opinion about that.
Honestly, I have heard some about them. I really don't know too much. I would definitely have to do some more research, but I think with a lot of things, some people try something and they really feel like they benefit from them. And other people try it and they're like, oh no, like never again, this was not for me. So I think with a lot of times, nutrition and dietetics is such a vast and emerging field, and there's constantly new things coming up that a lot of times people are trying something for the first time. And, if for your friend, if it's working and she's not noticing any like bad side effects, like that is great for her. But also maybe if you try it, it might not be your favorite, but it could be hers. So I think, a lot of it's up to personal judgment. And again, I've heard of them. I don't fully know what they entail. So I would definitely have to do a little more research on them before I put my stance on them.